Good evening, everyone. It's a great pleasure for me to continue the Ukraine Economy Week. My name is Natalia Shapovalova. I'm Vice President for Policy Research at Kyiv School of Economics. And the honor is because all these people in this panel, they contributed a lot to development of intellectual thought about growth for Ukraine. And they did their contribution practically. We are working in the central bank or help with development of think tanks and NGOs in Ukraine. So I'm glad to present Erik Berglof, who is now working in London School of Economics, but before this he worked in the EBRD as a chief economist, and he specifically contributed to growth of Fox Ukraine and Kyiv Economic Institute, the research branch of the school. Then this is Gerard Roland, who is a professor at the University of California, Berkeley. Both Erik and Gerard are members of the advisory board to Vox Ukraine, and they help all over with development of this initiative. Юрієм Городниченком, professor at the University of California, Berkeley, alumnus of Kyiv School of Economics, which encourages all of us to continue our work to produce more alumni like this. And Dmytro Sologub, who is now the deputy governor at the Central Bank of Ukraine, also alumnus of the Kyiv School of Economics and contributor to Vox Ukraine. So today's discussion concerns state and the economy. What are the leverages for development? So the discussion will follow in the following way. So I'll give up to 10 minutes to each speaker to present their thoughts, and then I will ask questions, and you will have an opportunity to ask and comment too. So I suggest that Erik starts first. Okay?
Okay, thank you, and thank you for coming here tonight. I love this place. It's a very cool facility, so I hope we can have a sort of very open and debate, and I'm used to that in Ukraine, and I like coming here for that reason. So we had a sort of similar topic for discussion yesterday, and I think I learned something from that discussion, and so I wanted to see if I can present the ideas in a better way so that it sort of is better understood. So what I'm going to talk about is, what can the state do to promote growth? Or industrial policies is basically, I think, about that, and at least that's how I will interpret industrial policy is the growth policy, and you have to sort of think about, what is it that a state can be expected to do, and that's going to differ a lot across countries at different points in time. And of course, what Ukraine has gone through in the last, say, certainly since the Maidan, a very dramatic transformation, I think. It's not always recognized, and maybe you don't see it so much, but for someone like me who come here, less frequently, some things have really progressed. There are many things left to do, and I'm not saying that we are at all out of the woods in terms of institutional change. So the whole institutional reform agenda, legal reform, the reform of addressing various aspects of corruption, all those things need to be done, and macroeconomic stability is incredibly important, and I think we are in a better place now than we were maybe 2 or 3 years ago. So, but what I wanted to introduce was thinking about growth going forward, because let's hope that we can maintain macroeconomic stability. Let's hope that we can push the agenda of institutional reform forward and really try to make progress. So once you establish those things, you have to start thinking about what can the state do in the economy. And as you know, there are enormous pressures on the state to do certain things, and there are special interests coming and saying, we want those advantages. We want to have some preferences in terms of customs treatment, or we want to have barriers protecting, our particular industry, our particular firm, and so on. So what I'm saying is that you need, in order to deal with that, you need to have a structured framework, so some ways to thinking about what could be meaningful and what would be not so meaningful, or what could be actually even undermining long-term growth. And it's that kind of framework that I want to talk about. So, of course, some people would say the only thing you should do is what we call horizontal industrial policy. So that means, basically doing things that lift all the boats. So it's about, improving competition policy. It's about education, providing the right type of education for what Ukraine needs. It's about improving the financial system. And again, a lot of progress has been made in those regards. But I don't think it's credible to say that those are the only things that a government can do, because that's not the reality of any government. And if you look around the world in terms of what's happening in emerging economies, that's not the only thing that's going on. So you need to have somehow a structured approach to counter all those approaches that you get from companies or from special interests, from oligarchs and so on. What is it that the state should be doing in this space, and what should it not be doing? And then, so if one accepts that it's not credible and it's not even probably desirable to have this kind of approach that you can only do horizontal policies. So at the other extreme, you have what we call vertical policies. This is when you try to directly identify individual companies or maybe individual sectors, and you try to help them grow and develop. And that also we know, national champions, that is very difficult to do. There are successful examples. I mean, you have in the US, you have something, like Tesla, which is, a very successful government-led or government-supported activity. And there is this notion that an Italian economist in London has put forward, Mariana Mazzucata, called the entrepreneurial state. It's thinking about the state as a sort of venture capitalist. It can get engaged in various risky projects, and it has sort of a portfolio of different things that it can do. I don't think Ukraine, and I don't think most emerging economies are ready for that type of, that's just too risky. You're going to have, so much political pressures building up, getting involved in that. So what I'm talking about is, what can you do in between those two extremes? So there are things that you can do that I think help individual sectors in terms of raising maybe the level of skills. Maybe in agriculture, for example, there are a lot of deep institutional problems about land reform, about cadastre systems and so on. But at some point, one also needs to think about how can we develop agribusiness, the whole industry that sort of relies on agriculture, and how can you introduce information technology into that sector? How can you help maybe textile industry, introducing biochemistry? This is what we call smart specialization. Taking traditional industries, introducing and supporting, maybe even subsidizing to some extent, the introduction of new technologies in those sectors. The more we see about what's happening globally, these what we call the global value chains, these chains between often controlled by very strong companies like Apple or Siemens or whatever, controlling flows of information across countries. So much more of what's happening today is about transfer of know-how and information across borders, controlled by very large multinational companies. And what the opportunity for emerging economies is to break into these value chains, to become part of those, because then you are constantly exposed to the changes that are happening. You are learning, you are raising your productivity, and the big advantage today is that you don't really have to compete. You don't have to enter these with the whole production process. You don't have to produce a whole car. You can produce a small part of a car, and you can build your credibility around that and competitiveness around that, and you can raise your productivity, and then you can sort of start expanding around that particular segment. And there's a lot of examples successful in Eastern Europe of that. Slovakia, even the Czech Republic, Poland have been quite successful in attracting significant parts. In some cases, even full automotive production lines. But it's that opportunity that I think one needs to think about as a state in Ukraine. How can you become part of that? How can the government, I'm not talking about huge subsidies and so on, but it's about ways of maybe using the way the government purchases things, what we call procurement. If the government can, through that procurement process, introduce standards that are the same as what you need to establish global competitiveness for individual companies. That's a process that the state can help companies join these global value chains. I think I'll stop here just to say, I think there is a sort of gray area, and that gray area between what we call horizontal policies and vertical policies, that gray area, we need to structure our thinking there, because that's the area that otherwise is going to be exploited by special interests and by oligarchs. Thank you.
Okay, so I'm very glad to be here, and so I would like to talk a little bit about the role of the state and how to think about this in the context of post-communist states. So if you look at economic theory, standard economic theory, which is what we call welfare economics, says that wherever there are market imperfections, when there are externalities, etc., that is the role of the state, and the state should provide public goods because markets are not able to do it. So when you think about it, the idea is that the government is thinking of maximizing the welfare of the population and is coming up with ideas for doing that. In the real world, it's not like that it's happening. It's a bit a naive way of looking at the role of the state. It's a bit naive, but economists continue when they come up with recommendations. They say, okay, what is the best from the point of view of welfare of the population? And we're going to recommend that to the government, and then they do with it, what they want. It's not our role. Our role is to recommend, and then they do with what they want. If they don't listen to us, well, it's not my fault. So the second perspective, so first welfare economics. Second perspective is public choice. Public choice is a field that has evolved several decades ago, and it's much more pessimistic, much more negative. From the point of view of public choice, those who are in government are mostly trying to think of their own interests. So they're trying to steal, take away things from other people. And so it's the view of the government as what is called the Leviathan. Now, public choice usually, this is a bit general, it's very pessimistic, but usually most of their recommendations is say, well, you should make the government smaller. If the government is smaller, things are going to be better. It's not always very helpful to come up with these kinds of recommendations, for all sorts of reasons, but very often you don't necessarily solve the problem. Moreover, one thing that public choice really does not take into account is that if you look across the world, there are all sorts of states. You have democratic states, you have autocratic states. Among the autocratic states, you have some that function pretty well. China, that's really, high growth. And then you have Zimbabwe, basket case, that's terrible. Among democracies, you have, let's say, Germany. Maybe a few months ago, I would said the US, but now, we're a little bit, have to be a bit cautious, Germany is not that bad. And then you have Greece. Greece is a democratic country, but Greece has lots of problems, lots of dysfunctional points of view. So how do you explain this variety when you see states? And so the third approach, which actually is related to my research, is what is called political economics. Political economics is using tools of economic research to analyze political processes, in particular what's happening, with the state. And so the idea of political economics is precisely to try to understand this variety, to see, how can you have well-functioning state, how can you align the interests of politicians with those of voters. So we should not be naive. Politicians are, humans like everybody else. They're they're self-interested. They're maximizing their own utility in the language of economic theory. How can you create institutions that are going to be in line with the interests of the population? Okay, now this is very general. Post-communist states. How does that look from that point of view? Actually, really not good. Why? Because by post-communist states, I mean what we call transition countries, but that's countries that used to be under a communist regime with a centrally planned economy. And so there's a specificity about post-communist states is that these were countries where the Communist Party had control of the economy and had control of the state. But the centrally planned economy, now we know it with hindsight, was very inefficient. And because it was very inefficient, actually the leaders were unable to coordinate economic activity. They were becoming worse and worse. You were just trying to get simple things like how can I get coal from here to there, or how can I get, a television that works or cars that work, and they were just not good at doing it, and then they just said, yeah, you have to do it. But giving orders is not a way of solving problems. So the authority of communist leaders became more and more eroded, and so what happened is that managers got more and more bargaining power in those countries. In Hungary, Yugoslavia, even the Soviet Union, managers managed to have more and more bargaining power, to have more and more autonomy, so that they were more and more independent of the state. And then finally, even though they were managers of state-owned enterprise, they just took it for themselves. They said, I'm managing this, I'm just going to grab it for myself, and I'm going to sell bits and pieces, but for my own purpose. And then when the communist regimes collapsed, what you had essentially is that you had political entrepreneurs, managers of state-owned enterprise or outsiders from the Komsomol, etc., who really grabbed pieces of the state and became rich very quickly. How did the oligarchs become rich? Not because they accumulated capital, at speed of light. No, they just stole from the state. They used the state as a way of stealing assets, of stealing money. And so the initial situation in post-communist states is one where you have different networks of oligarchs controlling parts of the government and actually, stealing the money from the interests against the interests of taxpayers. So that's pretty negative. But, so on the positive side, after all, in this country, there was the Maidan. People did not accept the corruption. People do not accept the corruption. They wanted to fight against that. And so what can be done? What can be done? Well, there are several things, and I'm just going to be short. One is civil society. If you have a very strong civil society, you can keep people on their toes. You can actually, you can ask for things. You can prevent things from happening. Second, values. If people are completely cynical, they say, oh, governments are bad anyway, then frankly, there's no hope. There's no hope. What is very important is that the youth, and I'm talking to you, is that young people say, we cannot accept this situation. We need a better kind of state, not like what Russia is now, but more like Germany or Netherlands or UK, whatever, and to fight for it. Third aspect that can play a role is actually the role of the European Union. Historically, Spain, Portugal, Greece were dictatorships. And then population revolted, these dictators fell, and then the European Union played a very important role in establishing democracy in those countries. It was not perfect, because I gave the example of Greece earlier on as a dysfunctional democracy, but it's a democracy. Same thing for Central European countries. They were forced to adapt the institutions of the European Union. Now, specifically in the case of Ukraine, I want to be very, very honest. I think you know, there's strong aspirations to be part of Europe, to be part of the European Union, but it's a long process. It's a long process. Why? Because the European Union it's not its role to change what happens in a country. It's the role of people in their own country. So in the last 3 years, many really great things happened in Ukraine. And I think if you continue along those paths, you try to consolidate democracy, if there is more transparency, if separation of powers are there, then there will be, you know, important steps. And not only, you know, will Ukraine be ready at some point, possibly to enter the European Union, but you can even be more ambitious. People in Russia, in Belarus, in other countries are looking at what is happening here. And if Ukraine is successful, believe me, people in those countries, there are millions of people who think the same way as people here. You know, this will be of fundamental importance. And because of that, this is why Putin's regime is so much trying to make the Ukrainian democratic experience fail. That's why they want the Maidan to fail, because they want to continue with countries, you know, the post-communist states behaving as they were, with corruption, kleptocratic networks, using the government to enrich oneself, hoping that the population will be passive and cynical about it. And so, you know, anyway, you are the youth, it's your role, especially as elite of the country, to kind of fight for what is right. Thank you.
I'll take, I guess, a more conventional view, which is really more like gross accounting. When you say, I want to get from point A to point B, what would it take me as a state to deliver this? And before I do this exercise, I should say I believe in Ukraine as a successful state in, I don't know how many years, but will be a very rich and prosperous country. And the reason why I think we have bright future is because we have a set of fundamentals which very few countries have. And in many ways, Ukraine is a land of opportunity. Let me give you a few reasons why I think Ukraine will be a successful state, at least economically. The first fundamental factor why I think Ukraine will be successful is because we are so close to Europe. I mean Western Europe, not the other side of Europe. We have one of the largest markets in the world. There is very strong evidence that geographical proximity to strong markets is a very strong factor for economic growth. In this modern age, when we want to get goods delivered very, very quickly, distance plays a huge difference. For example, imagine you want to deliver something to a customer in Berlin tomorrow. You can do it if you do whatever assembly of a good you have in mind in somewhere in Ukraine. You can put it in a truck and it's going to be in Berlin tomorrow. If you produce something like this good in China, it will take at least 7 days to get to Berlin. If you put it on a boat, it will take a month, right? So in this modern economy, we have a huge competitive advantage relative to many other developing countries. So we should take an advantage of this fundamental factor. The second reason why I think we're going to be very successful is because, again, unlike many developing countries, we have a very different quality of labor force. Our young people can read, can write, they're very advanced, they're very educated, the average years of schooling is very high. It's comparable to very advanced countries. Now, modern economic growth is all about absorbing new technology very, very fast. To have this absorptive capacity, you have to have educated labor force. Otherwise, you have no success. You can't really learn how to use a laser if you can't read or write. Right? So you have to really have educated people. And I think it's one of the resources Ukraine has. We have educated people. It can make a huge difference for us. The third reason why I think we will be successful as a state reflects also the tragedy of Ukraine as a state. For many, many years, we didn't have any economic growth. We're a very poor country, which means our wages are very, very low. But from an economic standpoint, it gives us a huge competitive advantage because our cost is so low that if we want to produce something and want to deliver to Europe quickly, It's so much easier to produce this stuff in Ukraine than, for example, in Poland or Czech Republic or Bulgaria or some other Eastern European country. Now, the question is, if we have this kind of advantages, what would it take us to fully exploit these fundamentals? That's a key question. You know, many of these advantages are going to be exploited by businesses. They don't need an active role of the government. But some of these advantages require things which can be produced only by the government. Gerard mentioned, for example, you have to build an infrastructure, a framework, okay, something which is going to support businesses in exploiting these advantages. For example, if we want to trade a lot with the European Union, right, we're going to have a lot of shipments of goods from point A to point B. The question is our infrastructure ready? And I think the answer is obvious, it's not quite ready. We should really invest heavily in infrastructure. It's a public good. Private businesses are unlikely to build a new railroad or a new road or a new port. The role of the government as this is going to be very important. Now, Ukraine is a capital poor country in the sense we want to have new technology to come into Ukraine. We want to have a flow of capital into Ukraine. What would it take to attract this technology and capital? Right, so clearly it will be some sort of institutional reform where we have protection of property rights, make sure that our institutions resemble to a large extent what we see in Europe so that this transition is as seamless as possible. What else can we do? Well, you know, we lived through a period of very high macroeconomic volatility with, I would say, a very bad policy of central bank before Dmitry joined it. Now we achieved macroeconomic stabilization. We have low and stable inflation. If not, you know, this month, next month we'll have it. We take it for granted, but it's an extremely important constraint on many businesses. You can operate in an extremely uncertain environment. And it's the role of the government to make sure that, you know, all those people in the government, these institutions don't do something which is very destructive for the country. It may seem like a simple thing to do, very obvious, but it took us many, many years to realize that, look, the central bank cannot be dependent on politicians. It has to be an independent institution. It shouldn't be involved in crediting businesses directly. We shouldn't have an industrial policy run by the central bank. It should be somebody else. It shouldn't be the central bank. These are just, you know, some of the things which we can do, and I think if we all have limited resources, as Gerard said, you know, the state is very weak in Ukraine. We cannot do everything, but if we have a limited set of resources, we can just focus on these three things, like, you know, make a transition in institutions, try to resemble the European Union as fast as possible in terms of institutions, like standards and so on. Have sensible policies to ensure that we don't have a lot of macroeconomic volatility, build infrastructure. All of these very simple things, I think, are going to have very fast returns, very high returns for us. And after that, who knows? Maybe the sky is the limit. Thank you.
Thank you. Good evening to everyone. You know, I would start with some observation from psychology. Human beings tend to look for easy and simple solutions. That's, I think, pretty clear. Yeah, I mean, people would like to get rich fast, either, I don't know, finding a good husband or a good wife, yeah, or, I don't know, rob the bank or find some treasury and so on. And the same actually is about economics and, I would say, well-being of the population in general. People tend to seek for easy solutions in the economic policy. And they believe there are easy solutions. And in this respect, they normally turn to the state, be it budget or the central bank, yeah, because they believe it's quite easy. I mean, you print money and you get rich fast. Maybe. The problem is that this is a dynamic game, and this is zero-sum game. You can find a good husband or good wife, but there could be some downside. I don't know, mother-in-law, father-in-law, some other issues. The same in economy. I mean, you could print money, and it probably will help you at the first stage. But then the hangover would be even more difficult. So what was the solution? What was the base? And here I would say, very much reflecting what Yura just said, first, there should be a basis. I mean, you cannot find any prosperous country with a high and volatile inflation and weak financial sector. That's pretty clear. I mean, economy is quite a complex system. I mean, in order to get these things going, yeah, in order for entrepreneurs starting to open new businesses, started to produce some things in Ukraine they have been importing before and so on, you need basic things to be done. And these basic things, what we macroeconomists call macroeconomic stability. Low predictable inflation, maybe stable growth, exchange rate, which is not fixed as we had in the past, but yeah, it has volatility of the exchange rate is not so huge, sound financial sector and so on. This is the role of policy institutions to ensure that. Then the question goes is how aggressive should be the state in trying to promote economic growth. And here I think the main key word, I would say, is basically institutions. Yeah, you know, in Ukraine there is a huge discussion now about export credit agents. Yeah, there was one question yesterday saying that Ukraine and Albania are only two countries in our region which don't have an export credit agency. I know not much about Albania, but I know about Ukraine that, I mean, if you now set up an export credit agency and ask politicians to run it, I mean, it would not be a very pleasant experience. Yeah? Yes, there is a Hermes, there are good export development banks. Oh, look at KfW in Germany, it's so nice institution. I think institution is a key word. Yeah? If you don't have a proper institutions in the country, be it rule of law, anti-corruption legislation, I mean public service, yeah? I mean it's then difficult to imagine that these tools like export credit agency, development bank or something else would really work. Yeah? No, I mean as former Russian prime minister saying that we try to build something beautiful but we always got KPSS instead. Yeah? So, and I think it's very much relevant to the Ukrainian state. We try to build something beautiful in the state hand, but at the end we get all these problems now with, let's say, $10 billion. The central bank, not the central bank, the state should power into the state-owned banks for all the past excesses we have seen. Yeah? Even it's a part even from private bank. So basically, I would just stop here and say, I mean, that there is no easy solutions. There is no easy solutions, and the state should be very cautious, and I mean, I would say economists and politicians should be very cautious about thinking what the state should do and should not do to stimulate economic growth. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I will ask a few questions and then you will have the same opportunity. So the first question is to Erik. I'll try to connect several concepts that you mentioned on procurement, supply chains, and proactive position of the government in development of the country. So in Ukraine, we tend to think that procurement is corrupt, and basically the state-owned enterprises, they use this instrument to channel the funds to support their political positions in the parliament and respectively in the government. And again, these state-owned enterprises and the politicians in the government, they tend to represent the groups that are also the big business groups that control a huge part of supply chain in Ukraine. So it's kind of a bit of a vicious circle that we are using procurement not to promote growth, but to keep people that we need in positions we want. So the question is whether you have some ideas how this vicious circle could be broken, because now even with the reform of public procurement in Ukraine, we rather use public procurement to fight corruption rather than to develop green policies or SMEs. Thank you.
So I think that's a very good example that you're using. So that's exactly what I'm talking about. I mean, you will have government procurement, and you have to think about, you know, how am I using this? You will have tremendous pressures from oligarchs to have preferences in various industries or for individual companies. What I'm just suggesting is you need a framework for thinking about when you, what principles should you apply when you have this kind of discussion? There's not a country in emerging economy that is purely relying on just horizontal policies. So you need to have a framework for thinking about these issues. If you take this example of the Export Credit Agency, which I think is an interesting example, and you know, it's a kind of complex institution actually, and it can be misused or captured by special interest. But it can also, if it's done in a transparent way, and you know, I take it that this is not so easy in Ukraine, it can also become an extremely important tool to help understand risks in international markets and getting local companies to understand, you know, what the risks are, and you know, if it can be made to work, it can provide insurance for some of these risks that facilitates for companies to go abroad. I think the way you do it, and it's the way you also have to think about procurement, is that you create transparency around it. I agree that the first line of defense is to try to fight corruption, create transparency around it. I think actually a lot of progress has been made in this regard. And what I'm saying, you know, once you have done this, and I'm saying this is not fully, not fully there, but you need to start thinking about how you can get sort of more sophisticated instruments of the state. Otherwise, I think you will lose many opportunities.
Thank you. This is a very good answer. So, Gerard, the question is whether the open data is a weapon or a tool for civil society. So now we have this trend to open more and more government registers, to open procurement, and basically in this new procurement system you can see the copy of the passport of someone who was a bidder, and the contract, etc. And basically, even though some registers could be considered closed, but you can go and buy it somewhere on the black market, and you can connect all the dots, and some businesses are doing it. So basically with this opening of the data, we might create some weapon, not the tool. So how to balance this, and what the government can and should do to prevent some negative consequences of this openness.
So I have to say, essentially, it's a good thing. So I don't know all the details, but I think so. The digitalization of government services is good because it creates transparency. It eliminates intermediaries who, in the shadow, are trying to get bribes. And many people outside Ukraine are praising the Prozoro system. They say it's something very good, and I think people understand here. And I think digitalization of public services is the future for those reasons. But of course, it's not everything. So when politicians were forced to publish, their wealth, etc. Well, first of all, they did it. I'm not sure everybody did it in an honest way, but there was a lot of openness. And then, of course, the reactions say, "Oh, how did these people get all the money?" That's another thing. So I think the main thing about digitalization is that it creates transparency. If the public is informed, they can react, they can protest, they can ask for investigations, and I think to the extent that the judicial apparatus becomes reformed, and I know it's a very slow process, then things can be done. But again, I think one should not be cynical. It's very difficult to reform the post-communist state. That's something that's very important. And let me just give an example. There was a creation of the NABU, the National Anti-Corruption Bureau of Ukraine. And in the beginning, people said, "Oh, this is just a toy. Nothing's happening. Nobody is being investigated." But at last, Nasirov got investigated, and there were, many other big fish. They start to be investigated, and mostly what is really important is that when you see reaction to these reforms, when you see people who say, "Oh no, one should, limit one should limit this." So, for example, now there's this, project in Parliament to say the NABU should only investigate cases that are, not finished. And so let's make sure that a lot of corrupt interests can be protected that way. Now, people have to fight against that, and then some people in Parliament are supporting, corrupt legislation that is in favor of corrupt people. So it's a fight. It's a fight. And when you see people who are screaming, against digitalization, against transparency, then I think, it's a good sign that you're going in the right direction.
Okay, thank you. So last weekends we were listening with our Kyiv School of Economics colleagues to presentation of Konstantin Sonin, and he referred to the argument that was common among the academics, economists after collapse of the Soviet Union, that if we privatize the public sector and if we liberalize the market, we will facilitate kind of demand for economic and political institutions. But it did not happen in many countries, including Ukraine. And after each revolution, there is kind of revitalization of this thought that we need to privatize public sector and liberalize the markets. But, and the question is, this is to Yuri, from your perspective, what is the argument for privatization and liberalization right now, and whether this argument exists at all?
So I must start by saying that I'm a student of Erik and Gerard. Everything I know is because of them. I don't want to shift the blame or credit. But I'll just give you my perspective. One thing I learned from Erik and Gerard is that it's really hard to fight existing institutions. You have to replace something A with something B. You have to upset lots and lots of people in institution A. And one kind of successful experience of relatively kind of smooth reforms is China. When you had a dual track setup, you kind of keep the old system, keep it running, but in parallel build something else. It's going to be effectively more and more successful over time, and at just some point this old institution A will not be very important. It will be very easy to shut it down and continue with kind of the good institutions that grow in parallel. One, I guess, example of this happening in Ukraine is the Kyiv School of Economics. It's really hard to form education. You have to get new professors, new rules, new curriculum. It was very hard to do it from scratch, from an existing institution. And the solution was to build something in parallel, let it grow. And now for 20 years we have this wonderful economics program which generated lots and lots of good people for the government, for academia, for private sector. So when we think about privatization, what kind of liberalization we should have, maybe an alternative question should be, can we build something in parallel, maybe create an island where people can do whatever they want? And then, once this island becomes successful, then the resistance for future reforms is going to be smaller. And to the extent good governance is a very scarce resource, it makes a lot of sense. In part, the National Bank of Ukraine is a successful institution was because it had this island kind of characteristic. It was separated from lots and lots of political constraints. They can do whatever they want. They got the best people. And, eventually they're going to pull up all other institutions.
Thank you very much, Yuri. So my last question to Dmitry is about the reform of the banking sector. So my subjective opinion is that closing of more than 88 banks is extremely important for the future of the country. But if we look at some economic data points, we would see that it's very difficult to give to support those people who were depositories of these banks, and the estimated value of the balances that were in these banks is extremely low, up to 20% of this title value, and it is extremely difficult to sell these assets because the success rate of the auctions of the banks that are being liquidated is 2%, and it's not clear where we have a lot of chances to really recover the funds that were grabbed by these banks. So I would like to hear your arguments why in the long term this is important for the country.
Thank you for the question. I would say, honestly, the biggest challenge for me coming from the private sector to the public sector is that I'm not living in the partial equilibrium anymore. I'm living in the general equilibrium. You know, in partial equilibrium, you do care about profits of your institution. Yeah? In the general equilibrium, you do care. I mean, in the central bank of Ministry of Finance, you do care about a well-being of your country. And the problem, why it's challenge, because somebody has to suffer. I mean, unfortunately, especially in a situation like in Ukraine, there was no easy way out. Yeah, I mean, I have been talking about easy solutions. Yeah, there have been no easy solutions, and the banks have not been banks. Yeah, they have been. We discussed it a long number of times already. I mean, of course, I mean there is always question exposed. Yeah, whether everything was done right, maybe something was done wrong, and that was the costs would be lower and so on. But unfortunately, there are no easy solutions, yeah, and there might be some mistakes, I could admit this, yeah. But on the other side, it was pretty clear, especially for the banking sector, for example, that the way the banking sector in Ukraine had been existing is not sustainable. The same about monetary policy, which was based on the fixed exchange rate and so on. Yes, cleanup has been done, more or less finished with nationalization of private bank, but there is no guarantee that in the long run that would be a positive solution, but still quite a lot need to be done, yeah? I mean, with state-owned banks, for example, now 55% of the system, and we just discussed that state is not very efficient owner in Ukraine because of poor institutions and so on. Yeah, I mean, that was not our aim. Yeah, as I was saying, there was no KPI for the board members of the central banks that the share of state-owned banks should exceed 50%. It just happened. Yeah, I mean, and that's a big challenge going forward. And then also the big challenge is actually, I mean, you don't need sterile banking system living in the vacuum. You need the banking system which is supporting the real economy, which is lending to the real economy and so on. What you should have for that? You should have efficient owners of the bank, as I said about state, which seems to be not a very efficient one. That's a first big challenge for the central bank going forward. Second, the banks would never really lend if they have a huge stock of the NPLs on their balance sheets, non-performing loans. And now they have 55%. To some extent, it might not be so big problem because they already accounted for this problems in their balance sheets, but still, this is a big number, and that's weighing on their lending behavior. Yeah? And the third big challenge, you should have a proper supervision system, not to repeat the problems of the past, because honestly, apart from macroeconomic imbalances or something else, the poor supervision in the central bank was one of the main reasons why this crisis happened. The cost of crisis indeed were large, but we're not outstanding if we look at the world practice. Yeah? I mean, people tend to forget quickly good stories. Yeah? I mean, you ask somebody now about Sweden, and people know that Sweden actually, I mean, Erik probably knows, that Sweden went through a huge banking crisis in the beginning of 90s. And actually, when you look at the cost of the crisis in cross-country perspective all over the world, I mean, at the moment, the fiscal cost of Ukraine crisis sum up to around 15% of GDP. Indonesia in 98 cost 60%. Turkey in 2001, 2002, around 30%. But if you look at these sectors right now with their own problems and their countries, they're doing much better because they have been able to get it through and so on. But actually, we had a very good discussion in DC during spring meetings, and the former high-level official from IMF, she said a very interesting point. Ukraine was able to make a first step, which is a macroeconomic stabilization. Not all countries got there. Zimbabwe, Venezuela, and so on. So that's a basket cases. Yes, Ukraine was successful, but even lower number of countries was able to get to the second stage when you build a sustainable economy. But there are examples in our region, Poland, Romania, for example, and some others, and so on. And for that, you need the structural reforms, and you need to deal with all these imbalances we have been discussing, yeah? Privatization, court system, and so on and so on. And the success of the banking system cleanup we have been doing would very much, in the long run, depend on this one.
Thank you very much. So now people in the audience can also ask the questions.
Thank you for being here and presenting your thoughts. One issue that is raised time and again in Ukraine is creation of industrial parks or technological parks. And there are two main arguments in favor of this. One is that we cannot quickly reform the entire country, so let's create some islands of low bureaucracy, low taxes, good infrastructure, and positive spillovers will help the country. And the second argument is, look, Turkey has 200 or 300 these industrial parks, and if an investor chooses between Ukraine and Turkey, he will go to Turkey to industrial park and invest there. So could you please comment on these arguments?
So I'm no, there are fantastic examples of successful industrial parks or special economic zones. It was a very important part of China's success, and it's sort of what Yuri was talking about, having things that develop in parallel. But I think when you look at the global record, I'm not so convinced. I think, it's very hard to have sort of islands of institution in that sense, and many countries have tried to create special legal systems inside these zones and create special governance and so on. And what you see happening is that it's very hard to keep these things isolated. So rather than these islands becoming sort of centers of excellence and spreading through the economy, the opposite happens. That you get these special conditions and special interest outside comes in and exploits these opportunities. Unfortunately, I think that's most special economic zones and industrial parks have had that. I think there is a stage of institution development where you can do this successfully, and obviously there are also these kind of environments emerging spontaneously. You look at Silicon Valley, Hollywood, or these kind of clusters. I think there is something to this, but I think this is a particularly vulnerable form of institutional experiment.
Thank you. So there are two questions on the right wing, Vladimir Vahitov and someone I cannot see.
I think my question goes to both Dr. Berglof and Dr. Roland. About 10 years ago, Viktor Pinchuk brought here the first American-Ukrainian astronaut, and he was actually talking as the former director of Yuzhmash in essentially the same spirit as you are talking, that everybody is proposing Ukraine to become a part of the world value chain, whereas Ukraine, for example, has its own cycle of building their own airplane, their own ships, their own airspace industry, their own missiles, if you wish. And it looks like it is very difficult to get into the market with the entire airplane. He says that, okay, we came to the Airbus and they said, why don't you help us to build a part of the wing of the Airbus. And he said, we can build the entire plane. We have Antonov can build the entire plane. And the same like Antonov 124, which is one of the biggest planes, which is also in great demand. So the question is how Ukraine can satisfy its ambition to become not a part of the value chain, but to build something bigger, to build something which is really valuable. Because there is a huge difference in the value added of the part of the wing and of the entire plane. So that and Ukraine had capacity to build all those things 10 years ago, 15 years ago. Probably there are still something which remains right now. So the question is how to. I think this was actually that was burning them from inside. All those red directors that they used to build those planes, and now they propose to become a small part of the big chain. So how to satisfy this ambition? How to build something bigger? How to develop this ambition and within Ukraine? Thank you.
Okay. So yeah, this is a very good question, interesting question. So I think what I tried to describe before, and again I can recommend a very interesting book by a recent book by Richard Baldwin called The Great Convergence that describes this kind of change that happened to the way maybe the world looked when this person was brought by Viktor Pinchuk here. I think a lot has happened actually to how global production happens, and this fragmentation of value chains have been a very important feature of that. And not even China, when it produced its passenger competitor now for Boeing and Airbus, it didn't produce the pieces itself. It just put it together. And I think there's no reason why that final assembly is what really produces value. Actually, the productivity improvements may be in many of the different components, and those are the kinds of benefits you want to get out. There's no. Maybe there is some value to producing a whole car at some point, but I think what Ukraine should aim for is to become competitive in individual parts. So, but then thinking, maybe there are some suppliers to that particular. If you produce the gearbox, there are suppliers to providing components. So you try to attract those, and one then become competitive. Maybe they can start moving to other countries. So take Volkswagen, for example. They built supplier networks in Slovakia, in Poland, and then these suppliers then moved out and started producing in Spain and so on. So it's that kind of development. I think this illusion that it's so much value in just producing the entire car or the entire plane is I think is I don't think that's the way the world works right now.
Let me just say one thing. I'd like to connect actually the two questions about industrial parks or value chains, and let me say a little bit about China. China was very successful both in its special economic zones and also in its sort of exporting strategy. But sometimes people misunderstand what was going on. It's true that China was able to create an island where they did, and that's basically the Communist Party that just said nobody's going to intervene there. But what happened is that you had joint venture. It's private capital coming from abroad, using the labor force. The Communist Party, nobody said, this is what you need to produce, you need to do this, you need to do that. They just said, okay, we want to give good opportunities for investors, and they do what they want, but it has to be for export. So you have to understand that this is very much a laissez-faire solution in that sense. And you also have to realize that in today's world, the competition is so strong that you have like what is now called superstar firms. This is something we're thinking a lot about in the West. So if you're Google, you're number one. if you're Yahoo, too bad for you, you know, or no, but that's the reality. That's the reality, you know. And then you have Amazon, you know, and then you have, you know, I don't even know the names of companies that are competing with Amazon. So what does that mean? That means that it doesn't mean that there's just one winner and lots of losers. It means that, you know, those winning firms, in a way, are trying to set up cooperation using good transport conditions, as Yuri was saying, low labor costs, you know, institutional rules that are very important. Those are the important things. Those are the important things. I've seen too much, you know, I've studied post-communist countries for now more than 25 years. People coming and say, oh, you know, we were good in Soviet times at doing this. Now we're just going to do the same, but for the market, and we're going to be very good because we have the expertise, we have the human capital, etc. You know, even in advanced countries, you have the competition from the world market is such that you know, many European firms are being beaten by Chinese firms, etc. And so you have all these value chains. That's the only way, in a way, that, you know, the world market is going to work, because you're going to have big firms that are excellent in management, that know how to do things, that are going to collaborate with various countries, using the advantages of those countries in terms of human capital, labor costs, transport, etc. And that's the reality, and we have to welcome it.
Thank you. So first question there, and then Vladimir Stetsik on the left wing.
Thank you all for your thoughts. I'm Mike Alton, KSE student. So this is going to be directed towards the whole panel, but maybe particularly towards Dr. Gorodnиченко, because I found an old Vox Ukraine article of yours where you talked about this a little bit, so I'd be interested to hear your thoughts. So early in this conference, we learned that during the early stages of an emerging country's development, the countries should take on policies that are pro-business and later switch those policies to pro-labor. In Ukraine, Georgia is kind of regarded as one of the benchmarks of emerging economy performance. With GDP, you know, high GDP growth per year, it's become a commonly accepted, you know, knowledge that Georgia is a good model. However, in Georgia, the poverty level is orders of magnitude higher than it is in Ukraine, and the unemployment level is also worse. So what are the policy implications of that, and do Ukrainians really need to get ready for a lot worse hardship than they're already feeling in order to make it as an emerging economy? Thank you very much.
All right, so this morning we had a paper by Oleg Itschoki at the NBU second research conference, and I just want to restate what you said. And one of the arguments he was making was that if you want to have a successful economic growth in a country which is underdeveloped, typically you have to resolve some sort of financial frictions, and one way to resolve this problem is to make sure that businesses, companies accumulate a lot of retained earnings, and so they can outgrow these financial constraints. And one way to ensure that these companies have enough retained earnings is make sure they have very fat profit margins, which means labor must be underpaid, and you take resources, I'm oversimplifying, take resources from the workers and give it to the owners of capital, and then at some point, once we accumulate enough of capital, we reverse the roles and now give more bargaining power to workers, and so now we can enjoy all high level of wages. You know, one nice thing about being in academia, you can always disagree with what other people say. It will be one example where I think I would disagree with Oleg. I think it's a very interesting argument, and it's not, you know, that he wanted to show that that's the ultimate truth and that's how we should do it. Again, what I learned from Gerard and Erik is that, you know, when you think about the transition, it's not just, you know, a very simple dynamic optimization model where you take first order conditions and be happy with the answer. It's much more complicated than that. You have to think about the political economy. If you suppress labor, who would elect you, right? Claude Juncker famously said, we all know what we need to do, but, you know, the real question is how we'll be reelected. And we, I mean, Ukraine, live in a democracy, right? How would you make sure people are very, very underpaid? I think it should be something much more sophisticated and complicated. If we are short in capital, we should import it. We should have FDI. If we have financial frictions, you know, the National Bank of Ukraine should do something to resolve some of these financial frictions. It doesn't have to be very costly in terms of, you know, low wages to workers. And a few examples he gave was South Korea, China, all these countries. They had massive oppression, but they also have a lot of dictatorship right there, right? In a democratic society, it's hard to think of instances when people willingly took huge wage cuts to make sure that people like, I don't want to name names, but you know, very rich people in Ukraine were doing something which is very good for the country, and we should be very happy about that.
A quick comment on Georgia, because I think it is an interesting example, and you know, I had in my previous life a lot of opportunities to visit Georgia, and it's undoubtedly true that Georgia made tremendous progress in some areas when it came to fighting corruption, and you know, we had various ways of measuring that, and you could see that in those areas that I had targeted, like customs or like traffic police and so on, they made very real progress. In other areas, like education or healthcare, they didn't make at all the same progress. And I think what we see now in Georgia is a kind of a reaction to a developmental model that did not, left very large parts of society outside, both in the, if you go to travel around the countryside in Georgia, it's very depressing because you don't see a single young person. The level of technology in the agricultural sector in Georgia is almost non-existent, and so that whole part of Georgia was, you know, Georgia, as you know much better than I, was the kind of breadbasket, or the kind of fruit, not breadbasket probably, more like fruit and you know, nuts and wines, of course, very much so, was produced there, and you know, much of that has now gone away. So you know, and this is we're seeing in so many transitional situation and developmental situations where you have a development model that's pushed through and, you know, is successful in some specific areas, but it forgets or ignores or leaves out a very large part of the population. So I think that's the real challenge for Georgia now, and you see the counter action now, a counter reaction in the country because of this, and you know, it's you know, there are many examples like that, unfortunately, but it's sort of, we need to look at those failures too and try to see how can we make progress.
Good evening. I think there is a good link to the previous discussion about Georgia. Also some other countries, for example, Turkey, spent last 2 months there. You mentioned today, I think all of you, how important are institutions for sustainable economy, for economy development and growth. Let's face it, that institutions are challenged now by populists across the globe. I'm talking about referendum in Turkey, I'm talking about Georgia example, but US as well. So it's not only about Asia, in which, for example, democracy doesn't work, but also in some, let's say, purely democratic states, institutions are challenged. So I think our challenge now in Ukraine is to secure sustainability of our institutions. We developed good solution in a national bank, but how can we secure that it is sustainable? What can we do to secure also continuous improvement in those institutions? Thank you.
So there is a very easy solution. So we have seen a lot of negative meetings near NBU building in the past 2 years. So, but there was no one positive. So if anybody wants to defend the central bank, welcome. But
But in general, I mean, yeah, what you said, I mean, of course, that's now all over the world. Yeah, and I do remember I have been speaking to foreign policy journalists before US elections, and he'd been asking me about populism in Ukraine. And I said, what? I mean, we are now, I would say, I mean, populists are now all over the world. Yeah? And I would say the slogan, make Ukraine great again, is even, is even better one than the original one. Yeah? But I mean, just say a few words on that. In general, what's clear with the populism all over the world right now is that, again, people are looking for easier solutions. We are in low growth environment for long. Creative destruction is not happening very fast, despite we have seen a huge improvements, yeah, in some in the software sectors and so on, but manufacturing is lagging behind and so on, and therefore we have this populism on the rise. There is no easy answer to them. The answer basically is the sensible policies, yeah? And the same is for Ukraine. It's trying both for civil society, for technocrats trying to do it. I mean, on the other side, you see there is also great advantage Ukraine has compared to other countries like Turkey, for example. Yeah, it's actually what's actually my boss calls umbrella of international institutions. Yeah, I mean, and honestly, they very often works as a safeguard. And Erik knows he has been dealing with Ukraine and a lot of countries while working in the BRD. And I think that's a chance Ukraine have to try to keep some things right, really. Yeah, I mean, but again, I mean, let's see. I mean, I don't have a. I mean, I would not kind of bet. Yeah, that would be possible to defend central bank independence or not. I mean, we're just trying to do our job.
So just like, I think, you know, the question is very fundamental, because indeed we see populism everywhere. So I think we have to think of what are the origins of this populism. The main origin is really the Great Recession. That is the 2008 crisis, which has really rocked the international economy. And you know, it's the worst crisis since the 1930s, okay? So that's number one. Fortunately, the economic policy that was followed was not as bad as in the 1930s. So we have learned lessons. There were people like Ben Bernanke, Christina Romer, they were exactly in power at the time when decisions needed to be made. So I think Bernanke made mostly right decisions. Christina Romer, she argued for a fiscal stimulus. The fiscal stimulus, I think, and Yuri knows this much better than me, and he's much more competent on that aspect, but maybe it was too small in the sense that you know, the negative impact of the crisis on incomes, on unemployment was just so bad everywhere in the country that the stimulus was probably not enough. Now, in the European Union, even though the crisis started in the US, I think the German government has a responsibility in pushing for bad macroeconomic policies, because the German government, the thinking in economics, and that's why economics is really very important. The main economics thinking in Germany is that the main problem in macroeconomics is fighting inflation. And so when you have a huge crisis, they said, well, yeah, you know, we need to fight inflation. You know, that's, well, it's not there. You have, well, no, but it could come if you have a, you know, not tight enough, you know, monetary policy. And then what happens is that, you know, in Spain, in Italy, in Greece, in France, you know, massive unemployment. In the UK also, everywhere. And so Brexit might not have happened without the 2008 crisis. Marine Le Pen would not have had as many votes. Cinque Stelle that you have in Italy, you know, so all these political changes are really related to that. And so there's been, I think, a bad response. Fortunately, I think we're getting out of it, so that's kind of the good thing. You're escaping the fire. And there's another aspect, I think, which we do have to see, is that the Putin regime, that is really, I think, this example of this post-communist state that I was talking about, has been incredibly aggressive in terms of trying to influence politics everywhere. So they are the international of populism, the international of right-wing populism, you know, is from there. They have been supporting, you know, populist parties everywhere. They're trying to break down the European Union. They have been influencing the US electoral process. You know, what's really happening in the US today, we laugh a little bit about it, but frankly, it's scary. It's really scary what's happening, and so that creates a lot of tension. So in a way, it's a bit of a repeat of what happened in the 1930s, where there was mass unemployment, fascist regimes coming up. It's not as bad. It's not as bad, but we're fighting a little bit the same battles. Fortunately, I hope we have won a little bit. I was very happy that Le Pen did not get that many votes. I think the German elections also, Putin will not be able to influence them, and so but you have to see that in that international context. So the rise of populism doesn't mean that globalization, openness, etc. are the wrong thing. It just means that this crisis was a huge challenge, and again, as Yuri said, we live in democracies. So if people suffer under the economy, they will be unhappy, and that's the reason why democracies are also important, because democracies make it possible to respond to the poverty and to the misery and to problems that people are facing.
Thank you. So we have a chance to ask one last question. So there is one person in the middle.
Hello, my name is Vladimir. I want to ask Dmitry about bank system clearing. We know this clearing as bank killing. What does it mean? It's most controversial reforms. Why I'm saying so? That National Bank claims that it fights against money laundering. This is a really big problem for Ukraine. But when National Bank closed bad banks, money laundering came to good banks. And I want to say, my question is not about this. My question about mistakenly closed banks. For example, Supreme Administrative Court decided that bank Finansovaya Initiativa was closed mistakenly. And what to do now? More than 5,000 people lost their money. They think they can get them back, but what is decision? How to solve this? This is my question.
Thank you. I mean, first of all, about money laundering and so on. I mean, definitely would go not into the details and so on, but look, I mean, banking system as a central bank are not living in vacuum, yeah, and if we try to clean up the things in the banking system regarding money laundering, yeah, but in general, economy, unfortunately, has still some shadow pockets, yeah, I mean, dirty money will try to find their way, and I mean, we are aware of it, I mean, we're trying to deal with it, and I would say the extent of the money laundering in the banking system is now, I mean, 10 times, dozens times lower than it used to be. But to say it's fully eliminated, no, I mean, we could not say it like that. I mean, but it's actually much lower. Regarding, I would not comment on the particular cases and so on, as I said, regarding banks. As I said, I mean, yes, I mean, somebody has to do a dirty job, unfortunately. Yeah, and when we say about 5,000 people, yes, but Ukraine is a country of 45 million people. Yeah, that's a difference. That's actually the case I was saying about general equilibrium issue. Yeah, and when it goes to the court system, actually, I think the central bank has more than 10 cases here when the banks are fighting the central bank in court regarding the decisions which has been made and so on. I mean, and there again, I mean, we have been making this decision based on our professional judgment and based on Ukrainian laws and so on, because we have been given authority to do so. Yeah, but it's a right of people to appeal. But definitely for us, what was very much stressed and reiterated by myself and my colleagues, we would like definitely to see also the improvements in the court system, because sometimes we get a very notorious cases. Yeah, so.
Thank you. So now we will have a few minutes for the final remarks. Similarly, as Yuri mentioned, I'm learning from all of you, and I would like to share the positive externality with the audience. So here there are a lot of people who are in the beginning of their professional life, and the question is, what would be your advice to young people how to build their career so that then in their 30s, 40s and 50s they can build their legacy in their country, be sure that they made at least epsilon but impact on their country.
Well, whenever students come to ask me for advice, I say, one thing, and I think it goes particularly for women students or female students, because I think they still are facing greater challenges than men, is you get some tools, they can never take them away from you. And I think that's what you have, of course, the world may not, in looking at it from the perspective of Ukraine, may say, some of these tools may not be so useful just at this moment because, there may not be jobs that really allow you to use those tools. But that time will come, and just get these tools, and the time will come for you to use them, and no one can take them away from you.
Yes, so I want to iterate. I think economics is a fantastic discipline. It gives you tools, both in the private sector, in the public sector, but I think it gives you intellectual tools to think about the world. These are important tools. And another thing is that I think when you learn economics, you learn also to debate. That's when we debate among ourselves, it's not trying to be right. It's not trying to shout louder than the other. It's not trying to use your argument of authority or insulting people or saying, oh, you are like these people, or you're like those people, or you're trying to defend this interest. It's really about honest exchange of ideas, being ready to accept that you're wrong. If somebody who's discussing with you says, you're wrong. Sometimes we're in seminars, somebody comes up with a very good objection, you say, I have to say that's, it hurts to feel that, but it's like that. And I think it's via honest, rational debate based on logic, based on evidence, that we can progress, both inside enterprises, in the public sphere. I think that's really the way forward. And I think you have tools, and so you have not only a chance because of the education you receive, but also responsibility towards others. Yeah.
Thank you. I'll be very brief. If you all want to do what Erik and Gerard said, you should become students at the Kiev School of Economics.
Yeah, I would say two reflections. First, basically, never stop trying to get better on hard skills and soft skills and so on. I think that's important. Always try to learn something, to reconsider the things, reconcile, and so on. And the second is actually try to interact with good people. I mean, we had a very good event on career a few days ago, and that's, I think, everybody who was on the panel agreed that, guidance, mentorship played an important role in our careers and trying to get better. So I think that's really important.
Thank you very much. This is the end of our discussion. This was really intellectually very pleasant to talk to you. Thank you.
Дек-кэмп. Больше, чем языковой лагерь. Радио Дек.